What if the greatest driver of poverty isn't individual behavior, but the policies that shape opportunity? Good morning, and welcome to Disrupting Poverty Through Leadership That Delivers Results AM Talk Show. I'm your host, Dr. Tekemia Dorsey, and today we are stepping into one of the most powerful and often under-leveraged tools for disrupting poverty: policy and governance. Because systems don't change on intention alone, they change when policy aligns with purpose. Today's episode is titled Policy, Power, and Systems Change: Driving Sustainable Poverty Disruption Through Governance, Agenda 2030 in Action. The Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 1, which is no poverty, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 10, reduce inequalities, SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and SDG 17, partnerships for the goals, highlight a fundamental truth. Sustainable change requires strong, aligned systems and policies. But here's the challenge: policies are often created at a distance from the people they impact most. Let's begin by understanding how policy shapes poverty outcomes. Let's ground this in reality. A community had access to jobs, but strict transportation policies limited to routes and schedules. Sound reasonable? People could not, unfortunately, physically get to work. The jobs existed, the people were ready, the system failed. The truth? Policy determines access. Whether it's transportation, housing, education, or workforce. Policy either expands opportunity or it restricts it. So, if policy shapes outcome, why do so many policies fail to deliver results? That's a good question, don't you think? Well, let's explore. Some of the common challenges as to why policies fail to deliver results are policies designed without policies are designed without community input, short-term focus instead of a long-term systems change, lack of coordination across sectors, and weak accountability structures. A workforce incentivizes job placement, but not job retention. Organizations focused on quick placements, and long-term outcomes decline. The insight: because what policy measures is what systems prioritize. Quick placements will never yield the results that we're looking for. And because that meets more of a short-term goal than long-term outcomes. So policies must be put in place that's going to have measurable outcomes and things that can be reviewed for success. So what does effective results-driven policy look like? Effective policy must be outcome-driven. And when it's outcome-driven, it's focused on long-term mobility. It must be community informed. And that means it must be designed with those impacted. In other words, if policy is meant to focus on the homeless, then the homeless must be a part of those benefiting from that policy. Effective policy must be cross sector aligned. This is connecting education, workforce, and housing. And effective policy must be flexible, meaning able to adapt based on results. In a nearby city, a city aligned workforce and their housing policy. Not uncommon because you want to take silo issues and merge them together. By doing so, workers live closer to jobs, their retention improved, and the economic stability increased, not just for the employers, but also the employees. And what this showed is that alignments create efficiency and results. But policy alone is not enough. Policies determines how policy is applied. Let's address a critical question. Who is at the table when policy is created? A policy advisor board lacked communication representation. Decisions were made, but implementation failed. When community leaders were included, policies became more practical, outcomes improved, and as a result, the policies helped to shape perspective. Why? Because perceptive shapes policies, and policy shapes outcomes. As a leader or as an organization that you lead, representation is often not reflective of those in which you serve. And there's a plus side and there's a downside. The plus side is if the board is less reflective of those you serve and is more reflective of what the organization is hoping to attract in terms of quality, titles, experience, then that could be seen as a plus for the leader in the organization, but not so much for those that they are working on behalf of. And oftentimes, when policies or decisions are made, there's going to be a gap. And it's also oftentimes for leaders to find someone that is willing to sit on the board from a voluntary standpoint or not from a paid position. It happens both ways, but not to create a board and not having a reflection of the community will have its downsides more than its upsides. And then the flip, if there are boards that do have representation from the community, it could be positive, but it can also have a gap if that person doesn't show up, or if that person decides to leave, or if that person does not really understand what's happening in the community. So there's always going to be a pros and cons to board development and representation, but the overall goal is hopefully you can find someone that can have insight on that targeted audience that you're hoping to have or make decisions around. And once policy is in place, it must be measured and informed. To do that is easy, but it sounds more simple in theory than it does in practical application. In order for policies to be measured and enforced, leaders must track economic mobility outcomes, reduction in inequality gaps, and access to opportunities across populations. Recently, well, not so recent, but within the last 6 months, a region implemented SDGs aligned reporting metrics. And as a result, progress became visible, gaps were addressed, and funding aligned with results. The outcome? Accountability turned policy into performance. And that is, at the end of the day, what all policyholders, makers, and invested individuals hope is that accountability turns policy into performance. And finally, this must connect to global frameworks. Agenda 2030 emphasizes strong institutions, inclusive decision making, and partnership. Policy is the bridge between vision and action, strategies and outcomes, global goals and local impact. Without governance, goals remain simply ideas. Now let's bring this into action. And here is your leadership challenge. Identify one policy in your organization or community that is limiting access or opportunity. Let me repeat. Identify one policy in your organization or community that is limiting access or opportunity. Advocate for one change that aligns policy with measurable outcomes. Engage one new voice in the decision-making process. And that part of the leadership challenge is, I think, one of the most challenging because it's forcing you to speak with or engage or have conversations or develop relationships with people you may not normally do so. But it is beneficial on the other side. Because here's the truth. You cannot disrupt poverty without changing the system that sustains it. And systems are shaped by policy. If this episode expanded your perspective on policy and leadership, follow Disrupting Poverty That Leadership through Leadership That Delivers Results AM Talk Show. Share one policy you believe that needs to change, and tag a leader who has the power to influence systems. Because disrupting policy requires more than just programs. It requires policy, power, and leadership that delivers results. Thank you for joining yet another week of phenomenal discussion on Agenda 2030 in action and poverty disruption through leadership. I am uber excited to sign off on another week, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, 6 a.m., and hope that you are being blessed by these conversations that are expanding your thoughts, your actions, and your behavior. Until the next episode, have a great one. Download this episode, rewind it, take notes, share it in your network, drop a link below on your leadership challenges and how it's working. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, have a great weekend. and I'll see you on the other side.